comes to something like learning, a lot of people have like this idea about how smart they are or how good they are at learning something.
Okay.
But just in reality, that is formed from something that is not very accurate usually. Usually they're using ineffective techniques in suboptimal environments without good facilitation, and they've had bad experiences with probably assessments that weren't even very meaningful.
Before we get started on today's episode, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the land of the Darug people. We would like to acknowledge and pay respects to our elders past and present and the next generation coming through. Now, onto today's episode.
Welcome to the Level Asian podcast. In this episode, we're back again with Dr. Justin Sung and Michael Tsai, co-founders of iCanStudy, for another two-part series to dive more into their insights and learnings within the education space. We cover the flaws within the educational system, the difference between US and Australian students, how the curriculum is behind the modern world, and we'd also talk about meta learning. We also get a little more personal and learn the ins and outs of Justin and Michael's upbringing and the significant events that shaped them into who they are today, along with discussing the fear of failure and the perception of being perfect. We hope you enjoy the episode. Before we get started on today's episode, we've got something really exciting we want to share with you. We're hosting our very first live event at the Carter Sydney on April 27th at 6:30 p.m. We're super excited to have a very special guest join us, the incredibly talented communications coach, international speaker, and magician, Vin Jiang. You'll get to enjoy an intimate fireside chat with Vin, where he'll be sharing his thoughts and reflections on the Asian Australian community. Tickets are almost sold out, so grab yours now on our Eventbrite page. Link in the show notes. See you on April 27th.
I think the place I would like to start is, we were just talking about it before we started recording, was Michael, you just came back from the US. So tell us, if you were to crystallize, let's say 3 to 4 things of what you thought talking to the US system or the people in the system, what would you say they are in terms of education?
Yeah, so, I spent a whole month there in July, very hot, but, a really great meeting all sorts of people from all different backgrounds, all different cities as well. And one thing I think the American, learners I've talked to is that they really value standing out and being different. And a part of that is to fulfill their kind of individual pursuits of meaningfulness and happiness as well as obviously like financial wealth and, that type of thing. So I think for them, having more tools in the arsenal, becomes a very important part of diversifying their, opportunities and increasing more instances of where they can, do well and, achieve what they want to achieve. And I think fundamentally, when they look at learning skills, that becomes a very, very obvious potential barrier to them acquiring all these other things, whether it is, like I said, skills, whether it is additional knowledge. Look, like honestly, every single person I talk to without fail, and I understand I didn't talk to everyone in the US, but everyone has a side gig and everyone's into stocks, like every single person.
Why stocks?
I don't know. I don't really ask them, but I think it's something that is talked about quite a lot. And it's something that, you don't need to have necessarily a lot of money to get into, but it's a good entry point. And it's something that's different. And I think they really celebrate, success quite openly. And it's talked about quite a lot. And although I don't know much about stocks, it is something that they are very keen to actually know more about than like the average person.
Okay.
So I think with that type of mentality and understanding that the opportunity is kind of out there for you to get, and if you don't get it, well, no one else to blame except for yourself. Type of mentality is very frank in the minds of the American people I've talked to.
I spent about 2 months, I think, in the US, and I was actually staying at a liberal arts college during that time on campus, and I certainly felt the same way, where the culture in the US is very much so focused on, it's not enough just to do your core competencies around what it is that you're studying or learning. Everyone has 1, 2, 3 additional other things that they're exploring on the side that are really, call it extracurricular or it's optional, whatever it is, but they definitely explore it. Yeah. Whereas here, at least based on my personal experience, I've spent, everyone here just ticks the boxes. It's like, gotta get it done.
It's a checkbox exercise.
Exactly.
And, it's interesting because I was just really interested to see what they would say about the tall poppy syndrome. And they're like, what is this tall poppy thing? So I had to explain it to them. And then after I explained it to them, they're just kind of like, well, why wouldn't you want to be a tall poppy? Why wouldn't you want to be different? Because if you're different, and obviously it's a good thing, that you can bring something additional, right? Or something unique that provides value in ways that everyone else cannot bring. So they're kind of like, well, if that's the case, then I'm a tall poppy, type of mentality. So that was really refreshing. And as a result, I think the conversations I had were very interesting, very stimulating, and it got me to really appreciate the kind of effort they've put into themselves and trying to question themselves. Okay. And I think the way that they do that has been the way that they've always been doing that. They've taught since young to do that, the whole individualistic thinking thing. And as a result, I believe they're really, really articulate in about reflecting on themselves. So they would be very honest and say, hey, look, I'm not very good at this. And they would then explain, for example, and this is why. It could be I was too busy, got a little bit lazy, but they will always have a reason behind it, or they're looking for an answer. So yeah, that is something that I thought was commonly shared amongst the people I've talked to.
So then, Justin, do you see that, because I know you guys have students from around the world, do you find quite a vivid difference between, say, a US student and an Australian student?
Yeah, definitely. To the point where I can almost guess the nationality based on just the questions they're asking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if someone is asking a question and it's have you just thought about it? The classic one is people just don't. A lot of people don't take ownership of take responsibility. It's here's the excuse, here's another excuse, and it's are you an Australian secondary school student? It's just
your name, Brian.
Yeah, so it's just I definitely feel that the students that I've worked with, I don't know how much of it is that bias in terms of we're probably getting a selection of students that are particularly not just young students either, right? Professionals too, that are more proactive, that are willing to it's a course on learning, you got to be a certain level of proactive to take a course voluntarily on learning. But it should be the same in Australia too, And when we're comparing, side by side, definitely I see that the American students tend to be just more onto it, more engaged. It's just if there's a problem, they tend to be, I think, a little bit more solutions focused. This is generalized.
Is that due to do you think, how the schooling system is and how our culture is influencing how we've brought up our children?
Yeah, I think the culture for sure. And just the fact that, for example, hard work is just fundamentally needs to be done. Stemming on from what Justin was talking about, we get a lot of, for example, local students who question the, impact of the effectiveness of a technique because they're having a hard time getting their head around it. So they'll be like, this is difficult to learn. I've tried. Really, not a lot, okay? But it hasn't.
I had, oh my God.
There you go, yeah.
I had someone message me about how they've been trying for, I think they said months. And then they're like, I don't get it. I'm giving up. And I was like, well, how many times did you try? And he was like, at least 5.
In those few months.
And this is not, I'm not talking, trying 5 times. It's not like trying out for the Olympics 5 times. It's not like running 5 marathons. It's like writing your notes in a certain way 5 times across months, Most of our other students are doing 5 times in an afternoon, in a single day. So it's just this, the standard. I mean, that's a little bit of an extreme example, but
yeah, it is. But that's the general gist.
Yeah.
I definitely feel. And one thing that definitely came from the conversations I had with our students in the US is that we actually promote, our learners to slow down and to really think about, what they're doing with the techniques. And they all basically said that it was extremely refreshing to actually be able to take a breath of fresh air and focus on something immediately in front of you.
Right.
And they actually really bought into that and started really, really practicing, experimenting, questioning, all sorts of these metacognitive things they're going through that are new and making it their own. So I think ownership is a pretty big thing over there.
Yeah.
And I think it's if you don't own it, well, what else is there? So that's the common thing.
it might just be the cutthroatness nature of the society is, New Zealand, Australia, it's there's social system is set up in such a way that
Safety net.
it's safer and you can bounce back a lot more easily. And so I don't know like how much of a difference that really makes, but it's just like a theory in my mind that maybe if the safety net is not there, that it just really forces people to hold themselves to like, I got to make it.
Yep.
I mean, there's a whole heap of issues that can create though, you know, but at a simple level.
And it was interesting. Like I was just hearing about like how these students how these students, for example, trying to make it, like, they've got college, but then they've got like all these side hustles and like jobs and that kind of thing. They're knowingly going into a lot of debt, like a crazy amount of debt. Yes. But it's just like, yep, that's what it is. That's what it takes.
Yep.
And they're not afraid to add a little bit more debt in order to find like the solution. If it indeed helps them with what they want.
Yeah.
So they're really, I guess, driven in that sense, and they're quite, I guess, mindful of the whole ROI, return on investment type mentality, which is interesting. But I'll tell you an interesting thing. Talking to Asian people.
In Asia? Or
No,
just
in the
Asians in
US.
general? In the US? Okay, yeah, go on.
Pretty similar to
Yeah?
Asians everywhere else.
So they just, it doesn't matter which country, you're finding similarities across the board.
And this is just obviously from my experiences, but let's say if I talk to, I don't know, like 10 Asian people and I ask them, so what do you do? What are you studying? It's like IT, straight up, like 8 or 9 out of 10.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's skewed that much?
Yeah.
Really?
And it's like, so what's the motivation? It's just like, well, there's good, stable pay, that type of thing. A lot of the things that you guys talk about on this
Scarcity mindset, yeah.
on this channel. And it's interesting because you dig a little bit deeper and then you go, well, at the end of the day, like you get paid as much as I guess the value you can bring. And they've never like really thought of it that they owned their own value. These are the Asian people, by the way, just generally speaking. And that at the end of the day, like if your value is the same as everyone else's, that's where there's a limit to certain things. So there's definitely a massive like kind of gap in what they've been brought up to believe versus what is in reality. But yeah, like still like instead of I guess medicine, okay, over there is like IT.
So it's just a different specialization, because I think the common theme that I see based on what you guys are sharing is also that there's a difference between, we talked about just before the start of recording, which is what's the utility of what you learn. So like if you learn something, what is it supposed to be used for? What's the application of the learning, right? And I feel like a lot of people go into things learning because they kind of feel like they're expected just to learn that, but they don't really necessarily think about, well, what's the application for it? So I assume you see that commonality, particularly, I don't know, do you see it in sort of areas, certain industries, or?
It's pretty global. Like, in fact, it's a pretty like well documented phenomenon actually. And there's a huge sort of growing interest in actually addressing that and properly making sure that people are more intentional about what they're trying to get out of their degree or their, postgraduate or whatever it is. And it's slow moving though. Like people are just starting to get aware of the fact that students and like professionals are kind of living almost a little mindlessly, like just following the railroad for a certain period of time until they realize it's not working.
Right.
People are just starting to wise up to that really at like a official level. Realistically, it's going to be like another, 10, 20 years before the recommendations, like the mainstream message starts changing for people to be really like properly intentional about what they're getting themselves into.
But what's got to change though? Because you can let time pass like for 10, 20 years, but is there, we talk about the systematic change that's required sometimes for like either a culture or a mindset shift.
It's the systems at each step of the process. So if you think about like secondary, tertiary, and then industry, those three don't communicate as much as you'd think that they do. So secondary usually, like if a curriculum is successful, how do you measure that? They have better secondary results. If tertiary is successful, what do you measure that? Employment rate or something. If industry is successful, what do you measure that in? Performance, job satisfaction, retention, whatever it is. Tertiary is not measuring what industry is measuring. Secondary is not measuring what tertiary is measuring. So basically, it's just like an echo chamber of like what works based on their own metrics. So they're creating metrics to measure whether something works, but what works depends on what the system was designed to produce. But it's not leading through. So you're getting a lot of failure in these transition points. So between secondary to tertiary, people get this kind of rude awakening. Same thing with tertiary to industry. People get this rude awakening. It's just because it's not streamlined. It's hard for example, secondary to start changing the way that they're assessing things, or like, teaching, if that's not the way that tertiary is expecting it. It's hard for tertiary to do that if that's not what industry is doing. Like, there has to be that alignment, but no single system is actually communicating or changing the way that they assess or teach things so that actually is aligned.
Do you think it's possible to fix that though?
It actually really should be not that hard to fix. Like, like if you are an institutional like faculty head, you really should be getting deep insights from industry to inform the way that you are designing and creating your program and your assessment. If you were creating an entire institution based on creating people transition into industry,
right,
one of the first things you'd do is figure out, what does industry need? And you would just create your assessments based on that in a meaningful way.
And I think the alignment, is something that people need to be a lot more aware about. Like, a lot of the people I talk to, and this is general now, not necessarily the US people I talk to, they just expect that all this thinking has been already done to a very high level. And, normally I would say verify, like your thoughts, but I think there's just overwhelming trust in the education system.
It's that's
just blind faith.
Yeah, that's just like, it's already been done.
It's just not. And behind the scenes, it's just a mess. Like, it seriously really is a mess. I mean, like, you're not usually getting, not only are you not getting that level of communication, but even when you're trying to create some kind of like, like what we call work integrated learning, right? Where you're basically trying to learn something at uni that is meant to serve you for industry. Like, the process to do that is usually like so slow. And there's like all this guideline and research and whatever that's already out there, but because no one is measuring that, you're not getting like a curriculum ranked based on how well it prepares you for industry, because that's not being measured in the first place. They're measuring like an employment rate at like 1 month after you graduate. It's like, it's a relatively meaningless metric. 1 month is the amount of time that it takes for you to realize you hate this, and then you quit, 1 month and 1 day later, and now you're unemployed, So it's just, so there's no accountability and there's no incentive for institutions to really hold themselves accountable to this.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it's like, you talk to professionals, they're like, oh yeah, I went through school, I went through uni, and they taught me how to learn. And then I go, so what did they teach you? Like, can you explain it to me? Can you even, for example, draw like a diagram showing like the skills in tandem with each other? And they're kind of like, no. Then the question is, well, what did you learn? So I think a lot of what they're maybe referring to is the kind of struggles that they had to go through. And as a byproduct, fortunately, acquire certain like levels of awareness that previously they may not have thought about before. So things like, oh crap, like I've got like heaps of assignments and maybe like tests coming up in these 2 weeks. If I don't do anything different, I'm going to be in trouble. So maybe I need to like prioritize, manage time better. Okay, these skills, prioritization, time management, just as two, for example, of the many, talking to people in industry, right? Like those who are hiring. And I definitely had a lot of conversations with people who are hiring and who are managers. They're just kind of coming out and going, yeah, number one, they're like super variable in terms of their abilities. Number two, like, it's scary how like they've gone through all this and they know like everything there is to know in the textbooks, but they're not able to like transfer or adapt or like, grow in this new environment. And it's frustrating because it's almost like the answer is so obvious, but like, why do people just not get it? And I wonder how many people don't get to where they want to be, right? And actually attribute their experiences as being, oh, I'm not good at something because of this deficiency, right? Whereas if they actually just had these skills and like, I don't know, like when I went through uni, it was an interesting experience. I learned a lot about myself. I probably like was exactly that person who, because of these assignments and exams and tests and because I had other things going as well, I had to really get on top of it. That's what I learned. I learned a lot of resilience, for example, in uni. If anyone asked me, what did you learn in uni? I'll be like, resilience.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Because I did a lot of other things on the top.
Okay.
So I ran a business on the side, and it was involved in all sorts of random stuff. And when people ask me, they're like, "Oh, Michael, how are you able to do the things you do today?" And I just said, I kind of just did more things earlier than others. And like, I just had to learn how to get the experience, to be useful for me. So I just did more of that. That's all. So I just like started like a little bit earlier. Okay. And I guess I had, a little bit more of a thick skin maybe. But like, that's seriously it. Like, so that's not like some secret thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think about the professional space because I know we touched on students a lot, last time. But that, like you said, the rude awakening of going from something like tertiary education into the real world, the
really
professional
rude.
world.
Yeah.
It can be brutal
That's
because
very brutal. Yeah.
University or college or tertiary doesn't actually necessarily teach you what I probably constitute as some of the soft skills that you need. I guess some of the things I think about is like emotional intelligence, your EQ, perseverance. I guess even the social skills required to build relationships, and because there's so much nuance to the details. It's not just textbook, here's how you do your job. You're dealing with personality and dynamics. So I feel like it's a gap in tertiary as well, where they don't teach that. It's probably the same way when we talk about like, you don't get taught financial literacy during education. So are there any other sort of, even the same ones or other ones that you guys feel like that should be covered but doesn't get covered from that aspect?
Oh, there's a lot, Justin.
I mean, there's going to be lots, but the challenge is not what needs to be taught. Like, because a lot of people know that things need to be taught. The challenge is that it's like, when do you teach it and where do you fit it in? Because the curriculum's already packed. People are all like, curriculum designers are always struggling with trying to unpack their curriculums. And so, yes, they know that they need to teach about like financial literacy and whatever. Like, they may not hold it as a priority, but they still kind of like know it should be in there. But then the wall it hits is like, well, we don't have any space to put it in there. So it's like, okay, well, I guess we can't do anything about it. So, it is a combination. Like, they may not be prioritizing it. But a big issue is the fact that the curriculums are like really, really content dense. But then for what purpose? Like, for what purpose is it so content dense when like, most of your graduates, I don't remember, like most graduates don't even remember what they learned at uni. Oh yeah. Straight up.
Why do you think that people trust in the system so much without second guessing having to go into each stage?
Just this lack of like knowledge about it. Like, I mean, I think it's normal in society to trust some institutions because you're not given the reason to doubt it. I'm not saying don't trust like a teacher or like a lecturer or something, but like as a system as a whole, each individual may be intending to do, whatever it is. But if the system itself is not designed in a way to make that work, all you end up doing is a bunch of people that are getting their energy sapped away by the system, where none of them are able to exert enough influence individually. And the system isn't set up to amplify that.
It's like, does the system, do you really think the system has your best interests at heart? Like, when they don't even like know who you are?
Yes.
And then you don't even know who you are. So, for you to trust the system to help you figure out who you are, and then based on that, like help you get to where you want to be, especially in this super dynamic, world right now where, you could have like, 10 different jobs like throughout your career. And that's because there's an evolution of who you are and what you find meaningful in your skill sets and all that. That's complicated, But going back to, I think, one of the things that Justin mentioned before, look, there's a very dense curriculum. Okay. But the question is, why is it so dense? That's one thing to think about.
Yeah.
Is everything really like, why are some students, I'm not endorsing the fact that you should skip lectures and that kind of thing. But maybe you guys have personal experiences with yes. But why is that? Maybe it's because, could be the fact that they're obviously disinterested in learning, but could be the fact that they are able to learn, in other ways that are more relevant, that mean more. Sometimes you have great lecturers who explain things, make a lot of sense. And, I often think about a few teachers in my life where at that moment in time, because of what they said to me, like it was maybe like literally a one-liner, but that one line has stuck with me forever, and for us, I think we try to understand that could be us now giving other people, advice who are kind of having their struggles in life. But at the same time, like, what is it that you're really trying to achieve? And maybe with so much content, the answer isn't to, pick the better content, is to also look at enabling people to actually learn content much more efficiently.
Yeah, because there's a ceiling, like, sure, you can have more content, but if they're only able to like learn this much, then the additional content is purposeless.
Yeah, and look, you got to ask yourself, like, how quickly, right, does the curriculum like upgrade itself compared to the world, especially in the areas like tech.
Or marketing.
That stuff is like, yeah,
We know.
These are like the pyramid schemes of university, right?
That's right.
Well,
You know what I mean? You know what I mean, right?
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. Do I have to explain that?
No,
I don't
not at
have
all.
to explain
But
that,
certainly
right?
we can understand that, if we sort of pull it the whole way back, Industrial Revolution and sort of the system where it was built back in the day certainly hasn't kept up for sure, 100%.
Yeah.
So then the question is like, what do you do? Like, firstly, who's supposed to take it? And maybe it's not one person. It's definitely the system,
Okay.
right? I don't know. Am I triggering Justin right now?
Well, I had
thought
a really.
this podcast was supposed to be, like catch up chat, like No, good.
We're going
Justin,
deep.
Here you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I'm ever like on the floor, like unresponsive, just
Throw me in the mouth.
talk about the inefficiencies of the education
Spazzing
system,
out.
and I'll just be like,
He's awake.
resuscitate myself. Like I got around.
He's got a little band here. Don't talk about education
Yeah.
system.
Yeah, so, well, there are a lot of issues, but one of the big issues is that we don't really, I think, agree on who's meant to take responsibility. There's different schools of thought. The predominant school of thought, like overwhelmingly predominant, is that the responsibility lies with the educators and institutions. They need to up their game, they need to do better, blah, 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 blah. I am of the other school of thought, which is that the responsibility needs to lie with the learners. Why? Because I don't trust the system to be able to catch up fast enough. Even if I knew that the system was designed in an efficient way and all these like little things that I've got issues with, even if they were all fixed, just by the nature of making change at a large scale, safety is important. You can't make changes that are going to be detrimental and harmful to people. And it takes a certain amount of data and understanding before you make that change. That process of making sure you've got good data, collecting the data, screening it, repeating the trial, applying it, piloting it, getting data on that, and then implementing it broad scale, that is a process that takes years. Fundamentally, even at its fastest, it takes years. So that's not a bad thing. This gap, it creates safety, right? And that's something that's actually more recent in the last sort of 50 to 70 years of research practice. That is it's an intentional gap. It adds safety. But that means that existing, learners are going to be disempowered. If, you can't be like, I'm struggling this semester, let me wait like 7 years before the institution changes and I'll come back into the course. Oh, so much better now,
Yeah.
So like that's just not an option. So I personally believe in the imperfect world and the scenario that you've got, the realistic situation is that it is not going to change for you fast enough. And if you have a problem now, today, you are going to be the one that has to change it. So I think the focus needs to change towards that because there's no alternative.
Great.
You know what I mean? So yeah, the institutions definitely have a part to play. They need to come to the table. And I don't think they're coming to the table enough that they need to be. But at the same time, regardless of whether they come to the table or not, you still need to be able to play that game.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is, a lot of people, they, for example, go on the website of the universities and they look at, the kind of potential careers that you'll get out of this degree. And they're like, cool, if I do this, I get that kind of line of work. And I kind of ask them, well, does it say anywhere that there's a guarantee?
Yeah.
Right. So if that's the case, I mean, if we're talking about engaging with a service provider, okay, so let's say like a plumber, electrician, right? Just an example. It's like you paid X amount of money to get, this thing fixed. It's pretty clear. And I guess if it's not fixed, then I guess the common consensus is that payment isn't necessarily need to be due, right? So that just doesn't really happen at unis.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Or schools, for example.
Yep.
So that's just a general kind of thing to think about. And the other thing I was thinking about while listening to Justin was that in the US, like there are a lot of like very specialized grad programs. So you finish your undergrad, 3 or 4 years, whatever it may be. And as part of your undergrad to get into these grad programs, besides doing well in your studies, I guess in that process, you really question as to whether or not you really want to do it.
Yep.
Okay, which is interesting. But also the application process often requires extended skill sets to be displayed and shown and proven during these like interviews or applications or whatever. And I think a lot of people, they end up not doing what they thought they would, okay, in their like pre-grad degree, whatever it is. But then they would still basically refer to the experiences as quite useful because they gave themselves that opportunity, that time to experiment with things.
Right.
As well. Yeah. So that was also quite interesting, but I'm not sure if that's an intentional or, actually, you know what? It's not intentional. Okay. It's not an intentional outcome necessarily, I would say.
Yeah.
That is carefully designed for everyone to have that. Because I definitely know some people who don't have that. But the difference then is based on, well, why do some people have a very different undergrad experience versus someone else? For example, non-Asian versus Asian people, just as an experience. And they get very different things out of the same time period.
This episode is produced and brought to you by Social Wave. Social Wave is a strategic content marketing agency helping businesses grow revenue using video, podcasts, and SEO. Head on over to socialwave.com.au to find out more. Now back to the show.
So that's what I'm always really interested in as well. And then we go into the whole conversation of, well, should education levels be even determined by when you're born, right?
Rather than your rate of learning?
Yeah, for example, or like what you want to learn and what you want to do with what you want to learn.
Okay.
Obviously, that's much more complicated than just basically going, all right, if you're born at this time and this time, like you just slot into this like cohort type of thing. But, it's interesting because when you get to the professional level, right, there are, for example, younger professionals who often are very high performing. And then they would, essentially get, if you want to use the word promoted, or eventually find themselves in a position that maybe someone who is 10 years older than them, just as an example, cannot achieve, even though they have the same goals. Okay, so that's fair game, the way I see it, right? But maybe this is just too difficult, too much to think about. Right, Justin? Just too much to think about.
Well, I think Justin, and if there's one thing after getting to know Justin is you're someone who's very practical about it. Like it's one thing to theorize and say it should be like this, it should be like that. But then you have to go, well, what's the reality of the situation and can that be done, right? Which is basically what you're saying, Michael. And I tend to agree after you said it that, yes, the responsibility should be on a systemic level, that there should be something done about it. But you only live life once. Like you have to make the decision to take matters into your own hands and have control about your situation, which I think a lot of people don't, because I think certainly if I sort of think about people who do incredibly well, their definition of success versus the people who quote unquote don't do as well. I feel like there's some level, and I'm happy to unpack this with you guys, is there's intrinsic and extrinsic thinking. A lot of people point to the exteriors and blame what's around them based on the variables versus someone who goes, okay, what can I do better? How can I take matters into my own hands? And so, in other words, sometimes it's like victim mentality versus hero mentality about that stuff.
There's benefit to knowing like why you're in a certain situation. Like, let's say that you didn't do so well, you're feeling like crap and your performance is not good and you're not in a good position in life. Like there's benefit to knowing like how you ended up in that position and being able to rationalize and process that and whatever kind of emotional unpacking you need to do to like understand how you got to where you are. But at a certain point, knowing more about that does not change anything about the current situation. Like the meaning of a certain event that happens in your life, is ascribed by the individual. You can have two people with traumatic experiences, very similar, and they ascribe different types of meaning, and therefore the trajectory and the response that they have is going to be different. So understanding plays a part, but at a certain point, you just have to think like, what can I do right now that's going to change this position? I think the tricky part is that that's limited by what is possible to change. Like there's a scope within which you think that life can potentially be deviated. Like I feel that it's not viable for me to, at this stage of my life, become like an astronaut, probably, like just because.
Are you sure?
Yeah, like
I think there's one person, Justin probably could be an astronaut now.
You could be the doctor, the professor, the astronaut.
Yeah, no, I'm flattered of your confidence in me, but I don't share that confidence in becoming an astronaut. So like, it's one of those things that's like, if you think that you're a certain type of person and you build this concept around like who you are and what you're capable of and where these limits are, there's a certain amount that you can actually feel personally empowered to handle. And the difficulty is that it's not necessarily accurate. Your sense of who you are and where your limits are, a lot of the time are influenced by these extrinsic variables that you did not really have that much control over, that don't really reflect your capacity as such. Like, obviously, like, learning is the big thing that I focus on. So when it comes to something like learning, a lot of people have like this idea about how smart they are or how good they are at learning something.
Okay.
But just in reality, that is formed from something that is not very accurate usually. Usually they're using ineffective techniques and suboptimal environments without good facilitation, and they've had bad experiences with probably assessments that weren't even very meaningful. And so they form this opinion about themselves, about how smart they are or what they can achieve.
Okay.
And then that starts to influence what, the trajectory
They
is.
attach their identity basically to that in a certain way.
Yeah, but it's actually just a method. It's just a method.
And often, like, they would incorrectly, I would say, attribute their success at a school level to what they would be able to achieve at a professional level.
Like, how often do you see people being like, oh yeah, like, I thought about doing that, but I was never good at biology and so, something like that. And it's like,
Yes. It's a belief.
it's just,
it's
it's
fact.
Yeah. And that could have been because they had a teacher that they didn't like, or they just didn't really get like this one concept in biology, and then they're just like, oh yeah, biology is not for me. But it's just a way of thinking about it. And to be honest, probably that person, 20 years later, when they're a seasoned professional, they could probably go back to school and they just smash biology. Probably once they learn a little bit more about how they learn. So it's just about that scope of, what you think is possible, and how much control you think you can actually take versus how much of it is actually like an assumption that's been formed that hasn't really been challenged. There are a lot of assumptions when it comes to something like ability to learn.
And sometimes I talk to, students in their first or second year of their undergrad degree. And it's interesting, similar to what Justin said, but in a different manner. It's like, well, I did do very, very well in this unit, right, in university, whatever it may be. And therefore I'm in the position to give updated, credible professional advice.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, unsolicited advice, yes.
And they're like very confident, and nothing wrong with being confident until you ask a few questions in response. And they're kind of like, oh, I didn't think that was important because we weren't told it was important.
Oh, that was the response.
Yeah, like they didn't realize that like their advice was like introductory, maybe, like at best, in a lot of complex scenarios. Because, for maybe it to be more like learnable, like it was, look, like often people tell me, they're like, oh, this case study, for example, is like really complicated. It's not, man. Like you haven't thought about the people in the case study, And my experience with working with others is that the people part is like straight up the most complicated of all. Like you look at successful organizations, you look at organizations that were successful and then didn't become successful, you look at ones that just weren't successful. These are all the byproducts of people's decisions. So what about the people then? And like, oh, we didn't learn that. Like we just, it's like a technical thing. And, I'm not saying people shouldn't put themselves out there and, basically be confident in what they do, but there's just so much more. And one thing that came to my mind about what Justin was saying in terms of determining like, what maybe things you need to learn and things like that. Like recently I've been talking to some final year. I talk to a lot of people, by the way, all the time. Yeah. Yeah. And I get really tired. I'm talking to a lot of people, but it's good. It's good. Yeah. I talked to final year high school students and university, college students, so across the world. It's very interesting. I asked them the question. I was like, how much money you want to make? And I think everyone has a kind of general idea, like as to how much. And for whatever reason, in Australia at least, is like 100K. Like that's just
the magical number.
That's just the magical number, because it's like you've broken past the number of digits, and I don't know. And then I asked them, I go, okay, so have you thought about the kind of life you want to live? Okay, and usually it's actually quite colorful, the lifestyle. You would imagine, so I want to do a bit of this, do a bit of that, like all that kind of stuff. And I go, okay, so have you like had time to think about how much you want to make, for example, based on what you just told me, like literally what you just told me you want to do, right? Plus you want to like own this house and like like travel every other, like whatever, and you want to have a nice car too. I mean, these are all fine. And then they kind of go, oh, no. And I go, there's also this thing called tax, right? And they're like, tax? And I'm like, yeah, it's like a big chunk of your income. And there's this other thing called inflation. And by that time, they're just like lost it. But these are hardworking, people with like really genuine, like, goals that like a lot of the times maybe to like, hey, I want to help the family out. That's really common. Like one thing I can say about Justin and myself, like this is a little bit of a, I guess, sneak peek kind of thing. I think one reason as to why we work so well together and we're pretty much always on the same wavelength is our upbringing. Like both of our fathers had to work overseas for very extensive periods of time, like 10 plus years type of thing, in order to basically essentially fund. We funnily enough, both have older sisters.
Wow.
And almost probably a similar age difference. Yeah. But that was just a random point, by the way.
Yeah.
But the point was like, we always knew that having more financial, I guess, stability or like capacity would not require our dads to be away for so long.
That was the motivator.
That was a motivator for sure. Like that was very clear. Especially when back then, like, we didn't just like, FaceTime, my dad, like it would be through like bloody like fax, do you remember? I still remember the like dial tone.
Yes,
yeah. And sometimes it like kind of half went through and sometimes it didn't. And so that memory, for example, for me, made it really clear that although I didn't have it explicit, like this is how much I want to make in mind, it was a priority. And that was enough for me to be like, all right, like I can't just keep doing what I'm doing, right? Because if it doesn't work out, like I can't go to my already very hardworking parents, and now I'm married and I look at how they did that. I'm just like, that's insane. To do that for me was around maybe 10, 11 years of basically not seeing like your spouse for like pretty much the whole year.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then missing your kids, like whole upbringing, all that kind of thing. Yeah. Is like, it's, I mean, you can call it, I personally don't call it traumatic. Okay. But I thought for me, it was just
it was
way
vivid
of life.
Enough. Yeah.
It's way of life.
Yeah.
And it was a very important part of it.
Was that the same for you, Justin?
Yeah. I mean, it's a big part of like what I guess forms your character and personality and values and the bottom line of like what you want in your life, I suppose, like what's going to kind of push you to do something like, And I mean, I don't know why people are having this magic number of 100. Personally, my third eye opened at 102K. So that really should be the magic number. So, maybe do some more research.
Yeah. And then, I'm like, have you checked out house prices recently? They're like, but 100 should be enough. See, that's the problem. Is that assumption is like, it should be fine, right? But then, maybe the effort, and I was just talking to him this morning about this, like the idea is like, why do they not look into it more deeply? Is it because they're like lazy? Like, or is it like they don't know how? Like, what is it? But this is also a skill, right? Like being well informed. Like it's very important skill.
Well, why is it? Like, is it because there's no system?
Because you shouldn't, like, because, we can talk about what's maybe schools, for example, just because, a lot of these young people spend a lot of the time at schools, prioritize, right? It's just like, well, has there ever been an assessment where that it basically strictly assesses your ability to be well informed, right, for yourself? So not just one thing, but two things. And often
fail.
Yeah, and often I talk to students. I was just like, tell me about yourself, and the common answer is just kind of like, I'm 16. That's usually the age is like the first thing they say, right? And then they usually talk about like how many family members they have, and like what maybe ethnicity or where they're from, and that's it. But I'm like, look, tell me more about you. Like, how are you different from others? And like by that time, they're kind of like they're actively questioning themselves while they're telling me about themselves, and I'm kind of like, are you asking me what you're like, or are you telling me? So this disconnect. I mean, I think education just really needs to be focused on, well, it needs to be led, right, by the learners themselves. So this goes back to what Justin was saying before. So what do you want? Like, really, what do you want? But I think it's maybe being marketed in a way that's just like, it doesn't matter as much of what you want. Just go through this process and
discover it.
yeah, you'll be fine. It should be right?
Yeah.
But then again, like you hear about the success stories, sure. But there are definitely a lot more stories that have led to unsuccessful outcomes that, people don't talk about. I mean, the kind of success stories, I mean, those get people hyped up and, that kind of stuff. But there's no fun reporting on a sad case.
Yeah.
Right? And why would people want to do that? Like put themselves out there for the world to know about how they failed.
Yeah.
Right? And then you get the issue of like, and I think we mentioned this briefly last time, like the fear of failure. And you have expectations where on top of just trusting in someone else for your life that you don't even know much about yet, that you're supposed to be perfect from the get-go.
Yeah.
So, okay, if that's the case, wouldn't you want to prioritize, for example, learning skills even more? But nope, okay, it's just about getting through it and getting through with flying colors because naturally that's just how it works.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think at least, the common theme with many of our guests, they all seem to have similar stories where it was a lot of that blind faith, it should be all right. And then there's usually a tipping point, happened to be late 20s for many of them or early 30s because you'd had enough years under the belt of being out there in the real world and realizing that, hey, this is actually either not what I want, I didn't enjoy it, there was a multitude of reasons. And only then do they take the decision to start, moving into something that they're interested in or they really want to. And I think it goes back to the point of not only just blind faith, but the ability to figure out what you like and what you want to learn about. So we talked about this, which was what to learn versus how to learn, for example. And I think, like, for example, we recently just had like a team training session and it was basically, Justin's going to think I'm going to bastardize this, but like meta learning, like the understanding of like, if we were to give you something and go, right, we need you guys to take on this new particular skill, how would you approach the methodology to learning? And I don't think anyone sort of gets taught that, certainly in corporate or certainly in the work environment. It's like, here it is, go do it.
And you know what, like people are very scared of it. And of course you're going to be scared of it because you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, it's funny actually if you think about it. Like when I first started working with learning skills, it was just with students. And then eventually it was the parents of the students, and then that's how I kind of started working with professionals, right? And initially I was kind of apprehensive, but I eventually found out that basically they have the same problems as their kids, because you just sort of never fix it. These habits sort of get set. And so if you think about something like a skill, like if you're learning a new skill, how would you tackle this? People usually just have like no concept of what they would do because of the fact that they've never had like a formal educational experience of learning skills. Skills are just things that develop. Like, you just like...
It happens.
You just live, and then every now and again, like skills just like develop, and then eventually you're like, oh, I've got the skill now, and then like it's just kind of there, right? But it's a process that you can take control of as well. But the sort of concept that people have around sort of learning, if you say to someone, okay, like we're gonna learn something, what they're thinking about is probably like reading something and like writing things down or like watching something, or that's that sort of combination of it. But then, like, what do you think people imagined like 600 years ago when they said they were going to learn something? There's no such thing as a printing press. What are they going to do? Like, okay, well, I need to like carry this stone to the monk that lives at the top of the temple who's going to like transcribe this for me on a goat skin, and then like afterwards, what?
On a goat skin.
It lasts. Goat skin lasts, unlike paper.
He's thought about this.
So and then you like every night by the campfire you like sit there with your like goat skin cards, and then you're just like, okay, well, what is it that I need to learn? And then you do it, and then you get your like servant to test you. Except they can't read. So like that. This is not how people thought about learning, right? It's just learning in itself is actually like it's a complex process, but it's a diverse process, and it's in some ways, like you could say that it's kind of messy. There's a lot of back and forth, and it doesn't happen in this very artificial box of studying that we normally think of, like so academically, and. Like we are starting to realize now, very recently, that a lot of the methods of studying that you develop when you're studying in school and high school and tertiary, those methods of studying are not like very effective for developing true knowledge that is, useful, especially in a professional setting. So professionals that went through uni that way 10, 20 years ago, maybe, you know, it's outdated today. Their stuff is even, you know, more outdated. And so their concept of how learning is meant to be is not, number one, usually very artificial. And then number two is built on like a theory that isn't even like real. You know, it's completely just constructed because someone invented a printing press.
I think one thing that's just to add on to it quite interestingly, a few days ago I was talking to a parent, you know, and we're just talking about note taking, for example, like the whole idea of like linear notes, like, you know, how you had like pad paper and their own lines and stuff. And then, you know, I asked him like, how do you take notes? And this person happened to be a healthcare professional, so a doctor. And he's like, oh, my notes are messy. And he like kind of, as he kind of said it, he was kind of like, oh, a little bit like, oh, they're like, they maybe should be a little bit cleaner. But then like, that's just how, you know, he learns, right? And for him, it's worked very well. And, you know, no one else is able to read it, but it works for him. And after he studies, he rolls up the thing and just chucks it in the bin. So here's the thing. You go to a high school student, you write your notes up, beautiful, highlighted, you know, 3 different colors. Yeah, handwriting was like, can't be like above or below the lines. And then you spend like, for example, 2 hours doing this. Would you going to roll up and just chuck it in the bin? And I think, I haven't asked that question, by the way, maybe I should. But I think I would imagine, I would not be surprised if the reaction is like absolutely like horrid. Like, what do you mean? But then the reality is that, like Justin, you can explain this better, the whole idea of linear note-taking.
Yeah, so like knowledge is not linear, right? And like if we're talking about a professional crowd, like you know, you understand this, right? Knowledge is not linear, especially mastery of knowledge. That's not linear. So trying to represent non-linear information linearly, that's not easy to do.
Right.
That's very challenging. It's very time consuming, all these other things, right? But if you were to sort of challenge the like way that you learn something. So for example, like let's say that you're reading a new book on like self-development or something like that. And you're like, oh, this is, you know, I'm learning a lot from this. So I want to kind of make sure that I'm holding on to this information. And so what are people going to do? They're going to start writing some notes about it. Why? Why? What is that actually doing? After you write those notes, how good is the actual retention of that? Like after everything that you've written, is that, you know, does the act of writing it mean that's now in your head? Well, then why not you just write everything? Well, then you just learn everything, right? So it's clearly not just the act of writing. So if you ask the question, like, why do I even do this? If the only reason is because that's how I used to do it and that's how everyone else does it, then you got to really think, is that actually valid? Every professional knows in their own field, there are things that like mainstream uninformed people that they just do, but they don't realize that like that's not really the right way of doing it. You know, every niche has got one of those things. Is it so unfathomable to think that there are things that are widespread that learners do that are absolutely not contributing to their actual learning in any way whatsoever, but it's just normal because it is the way that just it has been done.
Yeah, and to extend on that, like for example, the idea of linear like writing, like in like books and things like that, that's really just a method of documentation. Like it's got nothing really to do with like what Justin explained.
Actual learning.
The actual learning, yeah.
It goes like this, you know, like if you could have like knowledge, right? This highly connected, organized network of knowledge where, you know, different things are important for different contexts and there's omnidirectional relationships and fluidity of this, you know, this amorphous structure of knowledge, okay? The best way to do that would be like cerebrally linked together, like, you know, the Avatar tales, like, you know. But that's
Professor X stuff, right? Yeah.
But that's also how they reproduce, right?
Yeah, it is.
So, I mean, the method of transfer doesn't have to be the same. However, you know, it would be best to like have some kind of cerebral link and then you restructure the neuronal connections in this other person to perfectly replicate that type of knowledge, okay? And any neurophysiologist listening to this, which if you're listening to this, well, hit me up. But also, you know, we don't know necessarily if there's like a neuron for every piece of knowledge or anything like that. But the idea is you want to be able to just have this direct transfer of knowledge, right? But that's not possible. So like, what's the best way that we can do this? Well, we have to, you know, use, you know, signs and different methods of this communication to deliver that knowledge, right? So you're taking this thing that is amorphous and all this other stuff, and you're trying to pump it through a filter that makes it comprehensible by the person that you're trying to teach. And so we do that with like speaking and words and hand gestures and books and notes and things like that. This other person that's on the other end of it, their job is to take that and they have to reconnect it in the way that it originally is meant to be formed, right? Otherwise the knowledge is not there. You can't take this that was distilled and simplified purely for, taking it in and just leave it as is and expect to have the same level of knowledge, because it's not actually the same thing at all,
Yeah, and if you ask someone who, has a relative mastery of their particular profession, and you go, well, can you explain this to me, how it works? I bet they will not be like, all right, bullet point 1, bullet point 2, bullet point 3. They'll be like, all right, where's a whiteboard? Give me some like pens. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I feel like I'm going to need to link everything. Yep. And then at the same time, just to prove the point that Justin was saying before, you get these students who, have beautiful notes. I have, through my experience, and I've been, I was reflecting the other day, like this is my 16th year now kind of thing, working with students or learners on different levels. And through this time, I had many students who've come to me like really proud of their notes. And I'm like, cool, that's fine. And it's like very neat, like I mentioned before. Usually girls are like, well, just way neater. Okay. Yeah. Like guys are just like, you can't even read what they're like, anyway.
I mean, like, that's empirically like that. you can validate that.
That's like a that's really
it's
like a law of the universe.
Fact, on every planet. It will be the case. Yeah.
And then they come to me, they're like, oh, I'm so proud of this. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I go, cool. So what can you tell me about it? And they're like, I haven't learned it yet.
Yeah.
Wow, that's the response.
Oh yeah.
They know that this is note taking, and then learning is something separate. And it's like, well, it's just a waste of time. Obviously.
And they will spend a lot of time.
Like a lot of time.
And
hours every day.
Yeah. And then a lot of them from, just a lot of these students are actually from like selective schools.
Yep.
I find. Okay, not
a lot of high
bashing on selective schools, but the point is like, and they're concerned. And they're doing this because they want to obviously do better than someone else because they're in a competitive environment, but they get worried off things like, my friend has like 3 more pages of notes than me. Like they might have things I don't have, right? And
there's a lot of insecurity.
There's a lot of insecurity. And it's like, well, why are you having all these insecurities? It's obviously because you're not achieving your goals. It's like you are on this journey to achieve this goal, and clearly the journey is not helping you achieve that goal. Insecurity is natural. Like I think it would be extra weird if you didn't think there's a problem. You're like, no, that's great, like, kind of thing. But that's the reality of it. It's just like people are just writing all these notes, and the addition of like, oh, Justin, this is a whole other field. It's like this is like note taking, like apps and things like that, and like what people.
Do you seriously think that this note-taking software was designed by people that actually know how like learning works at this level? Like, okay, look, I'm just gonna use like Notion as an example here. Okay, look, Notion is like it's a great app for what it does. Okay, how much thought went into thinking like, can this really be like an effective note-taking app for students to use? They don't know. They're software engineers. They're just writing the notes that they think that they used to write, but like I don't know how good their knowledge on learning science is. A lot of the software that's out there is actually not designed in a way that actually encourages people to note take in an effective way. So it's kind of just feeding into what people are already doing. It's just allowing you to do it digitally and allowing you to do it easier, which in a lot of cases, making it easier is actually making it worse because it makes it even more passive. Like for example, if you want to like relate 2 things together in a lot of software, all you have to do is just chuck it in some brackets. Boom, you got a quick relationship. You got, and you look at your map view and you've got all these things there, and you pat yourself on the back, and you tell your mom about it and pray to your ancestors, like, look at my notes, everyone. And then you hear, in your dreams, like, well done, like, but in reality, what is the effect that had? You just took a cognitive shortcut. You didn't have to think about it anymore, and the software did it for you. So where is that knowledge? Well, it's in the software. Is that useful for you? Well, it could be if you're a professional and all you need is like that second brain that has it mapped out, and you don't need to hold on to it because you can check it every single time. That's fine. But if you need to be in a position where you have to have that in your head and you need to know it, not just for like a test or an exam, but for a conversation, a discussion, a scoping, or an interview, or teaching something, then that's not going to be relevant information.
And it's like, well, why, for example, with note taking, have not people questioned it for so long? And a lot of people end up in uni, stop taking notes. Like it's quite natural. Like it seems like almost everyone goes through it.
Yeah.
But then
It's quite funny, right?
yeah.
Like, is that a lot of people stop taking notes, but it's just this binary thing. It's just like note taking, and then like you either do it or you don't.
Yep.
I'm sure there's like the
And you don't think about the why, behind like how that, like maybe you realize by that time it was so inefficient and ineffective.
like you think about this, right? As like your hand is capable of like doing a lot of like, different fine movements, right? And like note taking is this very, very specific method of like expressing this information. And there's like literally an infinite number of ways that information could be expressed. But instead it's just like note taking. It doesn't work. I'm just not going to do it. Rather than being like, well, maybe it's the method of note taking that's not working. There's a whole spectrum of other things that you can do. People say, what's the best method of note taking that there is? That's an impossible question to answer because there are so many factors that go into it at a cognitive level, that influence exactly what your notes are. Like you could have the same technique and two different people use it and it could look completely different. And the cognitive effects could be completely different as well.
Yeah, and there's this belief that, no, there's this one way.
Right.
Even though we're all very different, and I think everyone can agree with that. Like, even if you talk to a student, they can definitely agree with that. But no, like that, all these differences, don't matter at all. Okay, it's just this way or another way. And, let's not get into like highlighting, for example. By the way. Like,
It's like paintbrushing.
it's like, it's like paintbrushing. And it's just like,
The most efficient way to do that would be just to have highlighter fluid and just drop your notes in it. Like what?
Yeah, it's like, some people when they highlight, like they like number one, they change colors because the previous highlighter ran out.
Yeah.
Right, that's one. Another one is just like, oh, it's too yellow. I'll put a bit of
variety.
Yeah, a bit of variety, and that's like their reasoning. And they're apparently supposed to be learning with this. But
they'll start by highlighting maybe like a few things, but then they're like, I'm not highlighting enough. So they just start highlighting more, and then it'll be like, oh, but that's okay because like all of it's important.
So they highlight everything in different colors.
Or as a poor student, eventually run out of money, right? You can't buy highlighters anymore. Okay. So like, what do you do then? Like, do you like, like
dilute your blood.
Yeah,
Paint shades of red.
Yeah. But then like the question then becomes, well, why do people just kind of do this from the beginning? Like why was for example writing notes in this way, highlighting, kind of like almost institutionalized, right? And a lot of times, and I'm opening up a can of worms for Justin again, I'm just like triggering him today. But like there is a perceived way of success, academic success within, especially maybe the young years of schooling, and for those people who follow this certain expectation, they're kind of told as having I guess good behavior.
Yep.
They are obedient.
They associate that.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times to make things maybe more manageable, it's like why you're not taking notes. Like this is how you should take notes, for example, by a teacher, right? Why you're not doing this, and they get worried when people or students are not doing this. And then I've asked this is the can of worms. I've asked students, I was like, so how's your study going? And they're like, oh, I haven't really had time to, for example, improve on myself, even though they know they need to, because, they can see themselves drowning already. And it's like, well, it's because there's a lot of things going on with my life. I'm really busy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, what are you busy with? Oh, homework, right? Some students have like I did, I think, quite a bit of homework, but these kids are like doing like 3, 4, 5 hours of homework a night.
Wow.
Yeah. So if anyone's watching this and they can, like basically see that they're kids, or maybe you are the person doing 3, 4, 5 hours of homework, I'm like, man, that's a very large commitment. Like you finish a whole days of school, which is almost like full-time work. And then you come home and do another shift.
Yep.
Right. Essentially double shift.
Yeah.
Must be like, the ROI must be tremendous, okay, for you to like be committing to it this way. Yeah, like you must like be like, man, this is awesome. This is like the key to everything. Like for me, like if that was the reason, that's what I would do, And they're kind of like, no, I it's not really for that reason. I go, what's your reason for doing so much homework? I just don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah, teacher gives you a pat on the back.
Wow.
So like the whole motivation, I mean, this is not for everyone, right? Like I can't say this about everyone, obviously, but for a lot of the people I talk to, their whole motivation as to why they are doing what they're doing at school, learning, is to not get in trouble. So that the teacher won't, in the next parent-teacher meeting say, hey, look, your kid is not doing his homework.
You know what's funny? So
The way you said funny is
yeah, it's hilarious.
He smiled at me with that one, yeah.
And that's the end of part 1. But in the meantime, here's a little snippet of what to expect in part 2.
You're having like 300-400 comments on some of these posts that you're putting up there. And these people are saying, this must be, this person's 100,000 followers, this must be the way that I should study. And so they're basing their entire study strategy
Conclusions from that.
Yeah, based on this photo of notes that she now realizes is completely ineffective. She actually should close her account.
Thanks for listening to the Level Asian podcast. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode. And why not share it with friends and family who might enjoy it too? Also, make sure you head over to levelasianpodcast.com to join our email list and to receive the latest updates and get notified when the next episode drops. If you know a great guest we should feature, email us at contact@levelasianpodcast.com or DM us on our socials in the show notes. Catch you on the next episode.